Well, that was the Finance Minister speaking about this week's federal budget. Now, the Parliamentary Budget Officer has raised some issues he thinks all parliamentarians should be looking into. Yves Giroux says there are some major unanswered questions and a lack of crucial details in some of the major measures in this year's budget. He joins me now to share his thoughts on the budget document. Monsieur Giroux, thank you very much for coming in.
My pleasure.
Okay, well, let's start with one of the things which was much vaunted and a very big part of the budget is first-time homeowners. And so it's a homeowners initiative, but you have looked at it and you say there's some pretty big outstanding questions.
Yes, for a program of that magnitude and that will affect thousands, presumably thousands of home buyers, there are details that are still to be worked out. And we've asked Department of Finance officials and we've tried to have answers to these questions. For example, will the CMHC have a stake, become a co-owner of these houses? When will the CMHC stake or support have to be repaid? So we have no answers to that. And
this is the so-called shared equity mortgages. So
Exactly.
first-time homeowners would now have a shared equity mortgage with the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, but you say it's still unclear what that thing will be.
Yes, exactly. And when I was in the lockup with staff from my office, we looked at that, and these details that you'd expect may not be in the budget, but that people would be able to answer to. We're not in a budget, and since the budget, we haven't had any answer to that, which is a bit worrisome because of the importance of that measure.
You say it makes a big difference for the government because it's going to describe whether the government's liable for that money or CMHC is liable for that money. It also could make a big difference for the first-time homeowners as well, right, or homeowners.
Exactly, whether it's direct assistance from the CMHC or whether they have to share ownership of their house with the CMHC for the period during which they benefit from that assistance. And to me, the fact that there are no details available at this point suggests that it was a measure that was included probably at the very last minute in the budget stage. So maybe in the last few days or at most weeks before the budget. So that's probably why there are no sufficient details yet.
Okay. You also raise questions about another very large measure that's mentioned in the budget, and that is support for the supply management sector, so dairy and eggs and poultry. There's a commitment of support, but it's also, you say there's also unanswered questions there.
Exactly. So it's $3.9 billion that was announced in the budget to support farmers that are in supply managed sectors, so dairy, poultry, and other supply managed sectors. So the government announced support, but there's no detail in the budget documents on the form of that support or the timelines for that support. And worrying for me as a budget watchdog was the source of funds. And unusually for such a large amount, there was no mention, at least that I've seen in the tables in the budget document, indicating where the amounts were coming from, whether from other sources, existing programs, or new funds. Since then, we've been told by finance officials that the provisions in the budget are there, the fiscal framework or the fiscal projections take into consideration that $3.9 billion. But for a program of that magnitude, you would have expected a line in one of the multiple tables in the budget.
Well, the other thing that struck our, when we were going through it in the budget lockup was that it's $3.9 billion. This is compensation for the potential impact of CETA, the European Trade Agreement, and the CPTPP, the Comprehensive Pacific Partnership. But it's $3.9 billion, a lot of money. But what it wasn't also mentioned was even a time frame. $3.9 billion over 20 years is different from $3.9 billion over 5 years.
Exactly, and that's why I raise these questions, because you'd expect the Department of Finance and the government to have at least a certain idea, even if it's a notional profile by year, subject to readjustments depending on how events unfold. But you'd expect to have at least a basic level of clarity on these amounts.
Two questions remain. One, These are big programs, these are big ticket items, they're big announcements in a budget. Is this very unusual to have these items that are really not fleshed out in a budget?
Based on my experience, no, it's not usual to have that many. Okay. It's not unusual to have a few because a budget process is a long process, and there are always items that the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance decide relatively late in the process for which details still need to be hashed out. So that's normal to have a few, but what I found personally unusual in that budget is the number of such items where details will have to be announced at a later stage, will need to be determined. We mentioned the first-time home buyer program. The assistance for the purchase of electric vehicles is another example.
Okay, another question, and I can't leave you without, you found some things that were very praiseworthy in the budget in terms of improvements, in terms of budget making. Just simply for the layman, what would they be?
For the laypersons, I found two things noteworthy. So the budget is one document, and to get access to that funding, departments have to get supply from Parliament. So what was interesting in that budget, and that was started in budget 2018, is the attempt by the government to reconcile the supply process, the mains and the supplementary estimates,
the votes that Parliament goes through,
with what's in the budget. So there's a good annex that tries to reconcile these two, and I think that will probably not mean a lot for Canadians, but it will help parliamentarians when they go through the budget and they challenge the government on the budget and also study the supply process.
You also talk about legislation. There's a bit of clarity in terms of where where this will find itself in legislation.
Yes, another addition that is welcome is the inclusion in the budget plan of a small section that outlines the measures that will need to be implemented through legislation. So the Budget Implementation Act will likely contain the following measures, and that's a welcome addition so that parliamentarians can prepare in advance to challenge the government or to study the Budget Implementation Act when it's tabled. They know in advance that the following measures are very likely to be contained in the budget bill.
Okay, well, Yves Giroux, thank you very much for coming in. Thanks for sharing your observations.
My pleasure.